Hi, this is Ken Adams, and welcome to this edition of City Beat. And joining me this week will be Bob Cortright. And Bob was one of the, I don't know if you call him a plaintiff?
Petitioner.
Yes. On the LUBA decision that the City Council, the Salem City Council, passed last December to expand the urban growth boundary to accommodate a third bridge. So welcome to the show, Bob.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So you and, I believe it was 8 people altogether, filed a petition to have this decision reviewed by LUBA. And LUBA came back about several weeks ago with their decision. So what was it? And maybe you could explain it in terms that most people would be able to understand.
That's correct. I mean, LUBA, or the Land Use Board of Appeals, is essentially the state's land use court. So when a city or county makes a land use decision, that's the review body that looks at that decision and decides whether or not all the laws were properly followed. So you're correct, there were 8 citizens of Salem and the surrounding area that appealed the decision by the City Council to the Land Use Board of Appeals. And the Land Use Board of Appeals upheld several of our objections and basically sent the decision back to the City of Salem. So right now that urban growth boundary is not in place. Our urban growth boundary amendment is not approved, nor is the land use decisions to authorize the third bridge. So they're basically back to the starting point of having to show that the land use requirements are met. And we expect that sometime in the next month the City Council will be discussing and deciding whether or not to go forward with the third bridge and or what else to do.
Now, one of the things that struck me and others about the decision in December was that they were trying to get this decision made before the new City Council was seated, because they knew they weren't going to have a clear majority. And so they were worried about that. So they kind of rushed, in my opinion, they rushed to the decision. No question. I mean, if you've been following this process, as I think most people in Salem have, this is a process that has been going on for more than 10 years. And all of a sudden, starting in September, actually it was last August, in September, the council said, we want to get this done. They held a grand total of 1 public hearing to adopt a set of documents that is, 3 telephone books full of information and findings. And there was essentially no discussion among the council to deliberate about that decision. So they went from no discussion to a decision in a very short period of time. And that's one of the reasons the petitioners appealed, is we don't think the public had an adequate opportunity to understand the decision that was being proposed and to really have the kind of public discussion you want on the single biggest investment that Salem's going to make in our lifetimes. And one of the things, and I think we discussed this during our last interview, was that the amount of money for the bridge basically is maxing out how much money we plan on spending on roads and infrastructure over that very same time period.
Exactly, and that's, I think, a central point that every taxpayer should be concerned about. We have a regional budget for the next 20 to 25 years that includes the local money we expect to get, state gas tax and other revenue, and federal revenue. And that is about $435 million. That's over the next 20 years. This bridge alone would cost $425 million. So basically, if we spent every dollar we had for road expansion on this, we would have to spend every dollar we have on road expansion for this bridge. And that just doesn't seem like a good investment considering all the other needs that we have in the community.
Now, these would also then have to be financed through bonds, would they not? Because they would have to have all this money up front, not just over a period of time.
Well, that's a question that hasn't been answered, is how would we finance it? And that's one of the likely sources, is if we were going to build it anytime soon, we would be talking about a revenue stream borrowing against that future revenue, whether it's gas tax or tolls, which is the principal method that's been identified so far, or property taxes. So could be some several sources of revenue bonding.
But like then you have to pay interest on these bonds.
That's correct.
So the cost would go up.
Absolutely.
And the other part of that is usually with municipal bonds, the people buying those bonds don't pay taxes on them.
That's correct.
And so there's less money coming in as a result of that. So it's kind of a big hole in your budget. And one of the other things that kind of struck me is that there's I believe it's called the Dundee bypass, that the state is already working towards north of us, which I would assume would take some of that traffic away from the north anyway.
It's possible. I mean, not a whole lot of traffic on Highway 22 is that regional traffic. It's principally local trips in our area, but that would help somewhat once that facility is completed.
And it seems like this should be more of a regional or statewide decision about how to move traffic. It shouldn't just be a local one, to me. Am I missing something?
Well, I mean, one of the things that we're anticipating is some level of state or federal support, but there are, as you mentioned, the Newburgh-Dundee bypass. That's a project that's going to cost on the order of $750 million. We've spent less than half of the money to construct that. So there are other priorities in the region that to the extent there's state and federal money out there, that are going to be higher priorities for the state dollars. And I don't think either ODOT or the federal government have been particularly forthcoming about making a commitment to fund the Salem River crossing. So that's a big issue.
So if the city was to appeal the decision, what steps then would take place?
Well, I think that's unlikely. I mean, the easiest solution if the city's intent to go forward is to try again to amend the urban growth boundary, to go back and correct and respond to those problems that were identified in our brief and that were upheld by LUBA. So I think that's the course that we would expect the city to take. Whether they'll do that, we're unsure. I think you mentioned an important point, which is we have a new city council, 5 councilors who have expressed real concerns and reservations about the bridge. And we're hopeful that when they take the time and effort to look more closely at this, they'll decide that we can't afford the bridge and that we have a lot better choices about ways to improve and reduce traffic congestion in West Salem.
And what are some of those ways? Because there's a group currently working to try to get the bridge built, and they're West Salem residents for the most part. So what are some of the other solutions that could be looked at in lieu of building a new bridge?
Well, there are a whole series of things. And I mean, if you start with the assumption that we have a limited budget, then you aim a little bit lower in terms of what can we do that will make a difference. One of the things that we can start with is, well, let me start with kind of a basic observation, is the problem or the congestion problem that we have isn't so much the bridges themselves as it is the capacity of the streets and intersections on either side. Anybody who's experienced this knows that it's getting through downtown or getting through West Salem that is causing backups onto the bridge. So the more we can do to improve the performance of the street system on either side, the more we can do to reduce traffic congestion. So it starts with relatively simple things like timing all the signals to get the best performance out of them, to move as much traffic as possible. And there are actually a whole host of things that the city has identified that are in its transportation plan, but that they have chosen not to fund or implement over the next 20 or 25 years. So if they would move ahead those things they've identified for signal improvements, that would help. The other thing we can do is improve the ramps and streets on either side. One of the big problems, or the single biggest problem we have, is the Center Street off-ramp that goes north toward the Parkway. It's the Front Street off-ramp there. That's the one that backs up more severely than any other. A study that was done in 1998, the Bridgehead Engineering Study, suggested making that a free-flow ramp, so that instead of having a traffic signal at the end, there would be a free-flow ramp, the same way that we have on the south side to get to Front Avenue off of the Center Street Bridge. That kind of improvement for several $1 million, less than $10 million, would dramatically reduce congestion at that one point. And there are other ramp improvements we can make. The other one would be on the west side to the Marion Street Bridge to what's called Marine Drive, which is a planned facility in the city's plan. Building Marine Drive would provide another access point, a way for people to get around in West Salem without having to get on or off of Wallace Road. So that would help a lot, and a ramp that connected to Marine Drive would also significantly reduce that congestion on Wallace that again backs things up onto the bridge.
One of the things I discovered actually a couple of days ago was there's train tracks at Jefferson and Commercial and Liberty. And there's very slow-moving trains that go through there.
Yes.
And that stops traffic sometimes for a considerable length of time, because some of those are very lengthy trains. And can the city keep them from coming through at certain times?
Not really. The way our laws are set up, the railroads were here first, and generally they have precedence over road traffic. Now, that doesn't mean you can't work out an agreement with the railroad, but it means it's a pretty, you have to convince them and give them an incentive not to do that.
Give them an incentive.
Right.
So you were saying that it's most likely that the city, if they decide to go ahead, will try to address the concerns that LUBA identified. So what are those actual concerns that LUBA identified in the petition?
LUBA sent this back for three errors. The first was that the city had used an inflated population projection. They estimated what future growth would be, and the population figure they used was 15,000 higher than the state-approved population estimate. So that inflated the need for the bridge, and it also showed that there's a very small difference in how well the bridge would perform compared to doing other things. So we think if the city goes back and looks at that population issue, they'll see that the difference in performance between building the bridge and doing other things is very small. So that was one error. The second error was the city has policies to protect the Willamette River Greenway, and the bridge proposal included ramps that would widen the Highway 22 as it comes off the Marion and Center Street bridges for about half a mile from the bridges to the Rosemont exit, basically obliterating the vegetation along that. And the city didn't address its policies that say we want to protect the Willamette River Greenway and explain how the bridge is consistent with that. So they didn't meet that. And then the third problem was the city did not deal with planning and zoning to limit the urban growth boundary expansion to just the use that they're proposing. So when they're proposing a third bridge, they have to assure that that's what the urban growth boundary expansion is for and limited to, and they didn't do that. So those three things would have to be addressed.
Is there a reason why they didn't do that last point?
Good question. I think they thought they didn't have to do it and would deal with it somehow later. So I think that's an issue that they simply didn't address.
So that's one avenue they can take. And I would imagine then they would have to have at least some public hearings to discuss
Absolutely.
it.
I mean, again, the land use decision that they made back in December of last year is null and void. For them to go forward, they have to initiate the public hearing and notice and hearing process and give the public an opportunity to review and comment on this. Again, there are the issues that LUBA sent the city back on, and then there is the broader opportunity to, again, ask the fundamental questions here about whether or not we can afford a bridge and whether or not it's a good idea. And that's the thing that we as petitioners are particularly encouraged about, is we think with a council that's prepared to look at this seriously that we'll have a much better public discussion about the bridge and about the alternatives that we were just talking about.
Well, also, the other thing that kind of strikes me is that we had a fairly new city manager during this period. And I wonder if he might have a different view about how this should work out as well, because I'm sure he's looking at, forward in time, because it's going to impact what he needs to do. And we've got several infrastructure things coming up. We have the police facility that's going up that's been approved. We have a library bond that's coming up in November. And we also then need to take care of the city hall. That needs retrofitting. So these are all infrastructure, big infrastructure things that need to be done as well. And so if you're a city manager, you're not looking at the next election. You're trying to look way down the road for the financial health of the community.
Again, it gets back to what can we afford, and even if you just stay focused on transportation, we have huge needs in terms of reconstructing the existing bridges, the Marion and Center Street bridges, so they'll withstand an earthquake. One of the very good pieces of news about state funding is that the state committed to provide funding to reconstruct the Center Street Bridge so that it will withstand an earthquake. That's the sort of thing that we ought to be focusing our effort and energy on so that we have bridges that will stay up when we have an earthquake.
That leads to another question that I keep hearing hints about, that $425 million is kind of a low figure for where they're proposing to build it. That they what I've heard is that it needs to spend a lot more money to make sure that it is earthquake safe because it's in a
liquefaction zone. Yes. Yes. I mean, that $425 million estimate is a very vague estimate. It doesn't clearly say we're going to build a bridge that the cost estimate assumes we're going to build a bridge that will withstand an earthquake. So there's likely more expense there. We also have a lake, about a half-mile wide lake, gravel pit that's been excavated that bridge will have to go across. And it's unclear whether or not the cost of going across that lake, that's I think 30 or 40 feet deep, how much that would cost. And then there's one more element that I think people in West Salem ought to be concerned about is the bridge would close the Rosemont exit off of Highway 22. The city says we want to replace that, but the cost estimate doesn't include the cost of replacing the Rosemont exit. So there are huge costs out there. And let me just throw in a couple of other factors. One is, you mentioned it earlier, is there's a lot of inflation and interest charges to think about. There's a lot of inflation in roadway costs. And our State Department of Transportation has been generally not very good at estimating how much big transportation projects are going to cost. They generally underestimate that. So there are a whole bunch of things for us to be very concerned about in terms of what the cost of this project would be.
And I think there was also something that the state is mandating, or I don't know, or trying to get ODOT to do a cost-benefit analysis. And how do you justify it? Is something that I think is going to be difficult to do.
Yeah, I mean, so the concerns about ODOT's cost overruns on big projects was one of the things that caused the legislature to adopt this new requirement to do cost-benefit analysis on big projects. ODOT has not yet figured out how they're going to do that. I think we'll have to wait and see, but this is one of the projects that they would be required to look at in terms of cost and benefits.
And one of the things too that we've seen several studies that talk about widening roads and things like that, and within 5 to 10 years you're back in the same position. And to me that would be the worst thing to happen, is that they spend all this money and then it's only good for like 5 to 10 years and now they're talking about another bridge or doing something else or widening the bridge that they do have. So is that justified, my thinking that that is a problem?
Well, experience all around the country supports that conclusion. Is you really can't build your way out of congestion. And the reason is that when we add capacity, especially when we add a big jump in capacity, people very quickly take advantage of it. They make trips that they otherwise wouldn't have made. They locate businesses and homes in places to take advantage of the increased accessibility. And as you said, over a very short period of time, that capacity that we thought was going to reduce congestion gets used up and we're traveling even more than we did before. It's a phenomenon called induced travel, and it's very well known. And you can find examples all around the country of places that have built highways and the highway capacity got used up in a matter of years when it should have lasted decades. And congestion was right back where it was before.
So one of the things, too, that I noticed with the eclipse is they were predicting huge gridlock here in Salem and the surrounding area in the days leading up to the eclipse. And what I noticed personally was that the traffic on Thursday and Friday was greatly reduced. It was amazing. And that fear of gridlock kept people from making decisions about driving. And so wouldn't we be better off not expanding capacity and getting people to realize there's better ways to do things? Because, like you said, you're kind of inducing people to make decisions that make it more difficult for that money to be used wisely.
Well, I think people respond to the opportunities that are available, and if we provide lots of roads and highways, people will respond to that. And if there's congestion, we make different decisions, no question.
And one of the things, too, with the proposal where the bridge is going to go, which would be on the Salem side, would be Pine Street,
right?
Is that would only take traffic away that's going north. And not only that, but then the traffic coming down Pine Street would then end up in basically downtown West Salem. So their congestion problems in West Salem would probably increase greatly. It would not do a lot to decrease the traffic in downtown Salem, especially those cars. It wouldn't do anything for the cars going south in Salem at all. And when I've been driving around, Mission Street and those streets south, like State Court Street, they're all congested too.
And I mean, there are lots of intersections and the effects are different depending on what alternative you choose. It's what the bottleneck effect is. When you release a bottleneck in one place, you're just probably moving it down the road. The intersections that you mentioned in North Salem would be a lot more congested if we build a third bridge than if we don't build a third bridge, just because we're going to move traffic that wouldn't otherwise go through those intersections.
So what is your personal opinion about what's going to happen? I mean, there's a lot of variables, but what do you think is realistic to expect coming up?
Well, I think it's really up to the City Council to make a decision about how to go forward. We've spent more than 10 years talking about a bridge. I think the funding realities are we're not going to have the money to build a bridge in soon or in the next 5 or 10 or even 20 years. And if we really want to address congestion, then we need to start talking about the things we can do that are affordable and effective. And the good news, this is really good news, is that our adopted plans have a lot of these things that we can do that will make a difference.
It could probably happen a lot quicker, I would imagine, than building a bridge.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that the discussion about the bridge has been a barrier to doing those things, is people think we've got some holy grail solution in the form of a third bridge. And so we put off doing those things that might make congestion a lot better in the short term.
Is there a reason why maybe they're not doing that other than just thinking that the bridge will take care of this? Is it a way to force the bridge in?
I don't know. That's that's an interesting question. But I think it's that, again, they think, whether they're using it for leverage or not, that's the ultimate solution, and let's focus our resources. We're certainly spending, again, $8 million over the last 10 years working on the bridge as opposed to advancing other solutions.
Some of those solutions could have been taken care of with that $8 million.
They could have.
So your feeling is that this, the City Council is going to have to look at this and make a decision sometime in the next couple of months? And what should citizens be doing then?
Well, I think hopefully talking to their city councilors and expressing an opinion about whether or not to go forward with the third bridge. And again, I think as a matter of funding, it shouldn't. But regardless, people should be expecting the council to get good answers to these questions about how much is a bridge really going to cost and how will we pay for it. Unless we have good answers on those questions, there's really not a good reason for going forward with a bridge.
Well, Bob, I don't think there's any more to add unless you have something else that you think people should know about.
I think we should just look forward to seeing what our city council does.
Well, I plan on having the city council, various city council members come in and the mayor, so we can kind of continue this discussion with different points of view, and I'll see if I can get somebody from Salem Bridge Solutions to come in and talk a little bit from their perspective and see what they have to say. Because it's one way of getting people to talk about it.
Right.
And having these people that are players in this need to be talking to the public at large. So I want to thank you for coming in today
Sure.
and starting that conversation off.
Okay, terrific.
And this has been City Beat. I want to thank you for watching and join us next time.